Hi everyone. Really happy to be starting the second day of NDC Oslo with you all. So thanks for coming along to my talk, firstly. It's the second time I've been lucky enough to travel to Oslo for this conference, so it's great to be back here in what is a really beautiful city. Um, it takes me a little while to fly here because I live in Perth in Western Australia. So I try and make the most of it when I come here. And I know Norway is known for its kind of natural beauties and wonders and things, but I was really excited to go back to this donut store. And we're gonna, because of my excitement, I decided to theme my talk over this idea of this donut store that we're gonna be doing. And of course, if you're a local, come and find me later and tell me about more of them that I should check out. So my name is Anton. I work as a dev team lead at Doist. We make Todoist and Twist. We're an async first company, so everyone's kind of spread all over the world. And so it's an interesting environment to kind of be working and growing in. But myself, I've been in front-end development for quite some time, back when kind of IE6 was the standard for everything that we did. So it's really great to be part of the kind of exciting development that's happening with CSS, and it's so fast that it's able to be used in production now. There's some really great stuff that is going to be kind of making our development lives much easier. And there's all these added benefits for the end users as well, that we're removing JavaScript code that we're just not going to need anymore, improving the speed of the web, and giving us lots of new features. So it's pretty win-win for everyone. Now there's a lot coming, and this is kind of what we're going to cover. So we're going to look at how we can use some things now in a little bit of detail, and then the beyond part of it, we're going to touch a little bit lightly on that, but just so we're aware of kind of what's coming down the path. But this is a big list, right? But do not worry. After this talk, I appreciated the people that just chuckled at that. You're going to feel a little bit sort of more ready for what's coming in CSS and what's happening, and a little bit of knowledge about what's coming into the future. And if you're interested in kind of keeping up with what's happening, the W3C's CSS working group have kind of a current state of all of their specs. Now this is intended for implementers, not like day-to-day users of CSS, but it's still a useful resource. Web.dev also have a new to the platform articles that are kind of monthly rundowns of everything that's kind of coming. So that includes CSS, but HTML, JavaScript, etc. But as we saw in that list, we have a lot to get through. So first up, we're going to have a look at some of the layout that's going to be coming in CSS. Now, container queries is one of the most exciting additions to CSS that I can think of probably since Grid, right? Especially as I imagine most of us are when you're working in a component-first sort of approach to your sites or applications. So media queries are great, but there are times when we want our component to adjust based on the size of its parent and not the screen itself, and that's what container queries are going to give us. Support just reached a really great milestone. The three main engines have it. Now that is the latest versions, right? It's not everything, but it's made a great milestone. It is also part of Interop 2023, which is an effort to make all of the sort of CSS properties like interoperable between each other. So we don't have any more of those little quirks like what we used to have. So even if there are differences now, it shouldn't be long before they're kind of ironed out. Now we'll take a look at our sort of demo from our donut shop that we have. We have the same card component used twice on the screen. And then when we start to resize it, we can see that its layout is adjusting based on the size that it has. So not the screen, this is how much space it has. So if we were to have one of these components in a sidebar, it can adjust itself to that. Or if it was in a main section, or if they're both in that, it will adjust to the space that it has. So if we look at what that code looks like, we have a lot of parent containers now, and we have what's called containment applied to that. And that tells the browser that, hey, we're going to be querying this component for its size. When you add containment to the parent, there's two properties that you can set on that. And the first one is the container name. So we've called it card container here. And it's actually an optional property, right? But we'll see why it's important to use this in just a second. The second is the container type. The only one that's actually supported right now is inline size. Eventually, that will change and we might have block size or orientation or a combination of width and height. But what they sort of decided to do was get something out now that is going to cover most of the use cases. Like typically we want to know what the inline size is. So they went with that, right, to not slow things down. With containment set on the parent, we can then use this new container query syntax to check the width or inline size of the parent element. So here we're checking, is this container, so the container that has it, greater than 400 pixels? And if it is, then we can change those styles. So we change the layout of the grid to have a little bit more space, and the image gets a larger aspect ratio so that it can fill that space up. This is going to be super powerful for UI development if you're doing design systems or anything like that. It'll save a lot of effort in not creating other components or kind of recreating the same components in like multiple different ways. And a component can really be in a sort of independent piece of the puzzle in your application. Now earlier I was talking about naming it, that first optional property. And even though this is sort of very new, this technique, it's considered best practice to name this container. So here we have one container that's set to inline size, it's called card container, and we have a card footer that has the name footer. So if we didn't name them, the container query is going to go to the first one that it finds. But here what we can do is, as we're resizing our card, the button will be checking card footer for its size, and if it has enough space in the footer, it can show the icon or show more text. But if we were to move that footer into the text or into that area, it would still be able to adjust. And so that's why it's best to get into the habit of naming these containers now so that you can query them when you need to. Now this is a big shift in how we've done things, so the debugging is going to help us out here quite a lot. There'll be like a little badge or pill that shows the container that has what's called containment applied to it. And then we click on the other card and hover over it, it'll show us what the inline size is there. And so when we're resizing the window, it doesn't necessarily mean that the container is going to change size, right? So these are going to be helpful for just showing what we've got, what the actual container is itself. Along with that is container query units, or a new set of units that come with it. And this is really useful for those times when you've wanted, say, the button to be a certain percentage of that main container, but it might be sort of in other containers itself. So we're able to query the parent and set its size to a percentage of that, a little bit like how viewport units work. So there's a whole bunch of them, but you might be able to say the container or the query's inline size, and we're setting it to 80% of the container query's inline size in this. Now, even though this is kind of in the modern browsers, you still may need to support some of the older ones. And there's a polyfill available for this from the Chrome Labs team, and it's in maintenance. I think that's because all the browsers sort of have it, but that doesn't mean that you're not having to support some older ones. But don't use it on everything, right? Because you've still got that JavaScript wait and the processing time to do it. So you might use this when you really need to, but I wouldn't put it everywhere. You might see a bit of a performance problem with that. So if there's one technique I think that you will take away from this, it'll be container queries. These will be quite revolutionary to how we work now. Another one that we're going to have a look at, Subgrid. So the browser support is kind of interesting. Firefox has had it since 2019, quite a while now. Safari released it in version 16 in 2022. And despite it being part of Interop last year, 2022, we still haven't seen anything from Chrome yet. I think they're getting through some sort of foundational work. But I include it because I think once Chrome does, it'll be pretty widely available then. Let's have a look at what it does. So when creating a grid, only the direct children of a grid have access to the columns, rows, and the areas in that grid. But often it's necessary to nest layouts. We'll have components or for semantic reasons, and they'll have wrappers around them. And once you have that wrapper, you lose access to the grid. So these sort of cards are a good example of that. When you get these designs, everything's lining up, the titles are neat, the body's neat, the buttons are good, everyone's having a good time. During development, though, things sort of change. There's responsiveness we have to factor in, internationalization. Content can grow, like what's happened here in the body and the title. So our neat design is starting to look a little bit wonky now. So we can see when we turn the grid lines on that there's rows for each of these things, but the cards don't know anything about it. That's where Subgrid comes in. It's a property of grid template columns or grid template rows. It's not a new grid, it's not something that we need to do, we just put it on there. And this, we're simply kind of asking the grid to go to the parent and inherit what they have. Now, whenever the body content grows, so if we come down to our buy button, which changes the text, we'll see that everything is going along with it, even the ones on the side, and same with the title. They're now aware of the grid and will adjust accordingly. So we have the semantics and the flexibility. And I was mentioning we can inherit the columns, rows, gaps, and name lines, but not line numbers. So here we can see that main or body has the container, or the grid, pardon me, set with some named lines. Main inherits that grid, and then the card can position itself based on the names of those. So we can inherit them down and start to position our items. There are, of course, some limitations. When we inherit from a parent grid, we no longer have access to CSS Grid's implicit layer, and that's what happens if you add extra cards or items, whatever they may be. Grid will just sort of make space for them. It'll figure it out based on what you have. That goes away with Subgrid. You don't have that anymore. If you're finding yourself needing more of them, then it might be time to sort of turn to a new grid at that point. And we're also fairly tightly coupling the layout. So we often work in components. And so if we need to shift that component, we either need to take the entire container with it or have somewhere that is supporting that same subgrid as well. But Subgrid is interesting, and it's going to solve some of those frustrating alignment issues that popped up with Grid. Hopefully we see some positive news out of the Chrome team soon for when we'll have that in Chrome and the other browsers. Now we're going a little further into the future here, so you'll notice it's only in Chrome. Container style queries are similar to container queries in that they allow us to style based on values. It could be what the background color of the parent is. If it was a pink color, we might use a black sort of text to it. Or if an element is sticky, we can query whether it is sticky currently or not. So you can play with this now, but only in Chrome and only with custom properties. So we have a promo value of 0, and when it sets to 1, we can change all the styles like what we did with container queries. And sticking in that grid theme as well, masonry layout might become part of the CSS spec. It's in Firefox behind a flag. And you might recognize this in, sort of layout similar to like Pinterest, which I think made it like an interesting addition to the CSS spec, right? Because it's such a specific layout that, and we're kind of building a sort of solution for it. But why I kind of include it, why I think it's a good example, is it's one of those like one-line dream CSS things that replaces a whole bunch of JavaScript or anything else. You just say masonry, kind of like Subgrid. So we'll see what happens with that one. Okay, we'll move on to some selectors now. And the first one is has. I think maybe besides container queries, this is one that most folks are going to be excited about. Until I mentioned that Firefox doesn't actually support it yet. It's behind the layout.css.has-selector flag. Again, I'm sort of hoping that something positive will come out of that soon. The has selector has also been called a parent selector. A more accurate name, I think, is relationship selector, because you can do more than just select the parent of that. But selecting the parent is definitely what's like driving the hype for this one. It allows us to select, let's say, the parent element based on selectors within that container. Now, I'm sure there's been lots of times where you've had some sort of component and you're like, I wish I could style this card based on some of the information that's inside of it. So if we have our like donut card again, and we have one with an image and one without it, if we want to adjust the styles of, say, the parent card based on that, this is what that selector is going to enable us to do. So we can say the card has an image, and we'll change the border width to 4 pixels, right? So we're sort of saying, do you have this? Yes, I do. Okay, then do this styling to yourself, not to the image. It's kind of wild to think that exists now. There was always this thing that this was never going to be possible in CSS, but here it is. And I mean, it's a very basic example. There's a lot more we can do, and that I was this is why I think the relationship name is more appropriate, so that we don't limit our thinking to just selecting the parent. So if we have that, if we know it has an image, we might want to say change the card header. So here we're saying if the card has an image, what we want to do with the card header is display grid and set up a grid on it. And then with the card header, so if it has that image and it has a header, well then we're going to change the background of that and we could position it on the grid. If you were using React, let's say, before, you would have to be checking whether that image property is there or if it some way existed. And then you would have to add classes onto that component. So you're kind of pairing your JavaScript logic with your CSS logic. And now you can separate them because it doesn't matter. We can use CSS to check the details that we need, right? Simplifying our components and superpowering JavaScript, CSS, sorry. Now, if you combine it with the not selector, we can do the inverse of that query. So we're saying if the card doesn't have an image, then for that heading, we might want to sort of spruce it up. Is that an Australian saying? We might want to make it a little bit nicer and kind of increase the text size and do some treatment with the coloring, right? There's some rules, though, of course, to keep in mind, the boring stuff. You can't nest selectors, so we can't say the card has a button that has an SVG. There's too much going on there for the browser to sort of determine what that means. But you can chain them. So we can say that the card has an image and it also has a card body, and then I want the paragraph in that. A really interesting one I found is the ability to do quantity queries. So if we have a grid with an even number of items, well, it looks okay, right? But if we lose one of them, I don't know, we sold out at this point, our grid will look a little bit unbalanced. So we can sort of count. If we have 5 children, we'll make a new grid that's going to have the 4 columns, for the cards to sit there. And we can take the first one and kind of make it like a promotion card or give it some highlighted features. So we can start to now count what's happening, which again, we may have typically done in JavaScript before this. If a form element has an invalid class, you could change the form styling. You could make it red, but you would do other things for accessibility, but as an example. We can kind of use checkboxes as state. So if the body has an input with a value of dark that is checked, then we might change all of the custom properties on the body to make a dark theme. All with CSS, right? We can switch back to light. We're just changing custom properties backwards and forwards. You can redo the Mac OS Finder thing by having a hover state on one of the donuts and then having the other ones on either side sort of come up and match it. Again, no JavaScript in this at all. So it's a super powerful kind of magic selector. When we have it with container queries, it's going to be a game changer for intrinsically sizing our components and our layouts. Moving the responsibility of how a component handles its logic to some of the styling rather than JavaScript. So it's a good one to start playing with crossed fingers that Firefox has something new, some news about its release. But if you can think of a way to use this now, you can check with @supports for that. Do your styling with has, but make sure you have some sort of a backup in case it's not there, right? But you can use it now with some confidence. All right, let's have a look at some of the things coming in the Cascade and responsiveness. One of those things that I think trips up a lot of us is the Cascade. It's sort of one of CSS's superpowers, but it can be really difficult to handle. And that's why tools and techniques like BEM, Cube, ITCSS, and I guess to a degree Tailwind came into existence. They're to help developers tame, or in most cases just sidestep, the existence of the Cascade at all. The idea with Cascade layers is to make it a little more understandable and a little more approachable. Browser support is really good. There is a serious gotcha with this one, but I'm going to leave you on that teaser. We'll come back to it. But typically when we're working with CSS, the styles get imported and mixed together. Just, I don't know, there's lots of ways that CSS can come into a project. So we might have, say, a reset style sheet, custom properties, vendor, theme, so on, so on. The Cascade starts to become a mixture of like what was imported, the order, the specificity of the rules within that style sheet, and you kind of manage that mixture as best as you can. What Cascade Layers is going to allow us to do is define groups for our styles and then place the styles within those layers, limiting the cascade to those layers. So take a look at that as like actual defined layers now. Each layer is defined in order, and the order is still important here. So the utilities is the highest one in our layers and will apply over everything else. And again, with a new technique, there's already best practices in here. So we define our layer order at layer base, theme, components, and utilities. Why we do that is that if we then add another base later, it's going to still go to the correct group and the correct order. It's not suddenly jumping to the front. An entire style sheet can even be imported into a layer. So if we had a library or a vendor style sheet, we can just whoop into that layer. And I was mentioning that the specificity is now limited to the layer itself. So if we have a style in a lower layer that has a higher specificity, such as what's happening here, the ULLI first child, it's got a high specificity, 0012. But theme has 0001 specificity. It's a very simple selector. But because theme is on top of base, we can see that the text does not have the text underline, and it's the purple color instead of red. So it's helping us to say if we had a really aggressive vendor style sheet. Has anyone worked with ad style sheets before? Very aggressive. And so we can kind of win over some of those things by using layers. You can nest them as well. If you really want to like get precise, you can have theme.customprops or themes.spacing. I don't know. But the dev tools, again, this is another like big shift in how we think about things. So the dev tools are coming along to help us out. It'll show the order of the layers and their names. And then if we have the anchor here that's highlighted, it's showing us that this CSS is coming from the demo layer, whereas the other layer down the bottom is coming from reset. So it'll help us to visualize what's happening. I was talking about some of the gotchas at the start. So styles that are not explicitly put in a layer do become a layer, an anonymous layer, and that layer is on the top of everything else. So if it's not put in one, it does become one, and it becomes a very high one. Important, so as in like bang, important, is still going to play a part. So if I have important on a layer, it's going to inverse the order of the layers. So if we had that, it's going to inverse them and then find the first one. So where before we had our layers in an order, it flips it and then goes through until it finds the highest one. So the order of our things kind of completely change, right? They flip. And so an aggressive vendor style sheet could still come through here if they've used important. And they're not scoping. So one of the reasons for tools like I mentioned, BEM, etc., is to sort of get the idea of scoping our CSS. This is not what that's doing. So if we have layer base and layer card, both of them have paragraphs styled with colors. Layer card is not scoped to something called card. It's just a layer within CSS. So the paragraph color is going to be brand purple here and not brand dark. And the big one, now that you might be really excited about Cascade Layers. While the browser support is good, something bad happens if Cascade Layers isn't supported in that browser. So typically with CSS, if it doesn't support a feature, it just ignores it. And this is really helpful for progressive enhancement. We'll do it, and if the browser doesn't know it, it doesn't just fall over and crash. It just goes, oh, I'll just ignore that. And so what happens with Cascade Layers is if we have this with all of our neat ordered style sheets, we end up with just button now. So That's unfortunate. This is one of those features that I think is really exciting, and it's going to be great for understanding CSS and some of that core functionality of it. We can place the reset style sheets, advertising styles, vendor styling low, and have freedom to really win out over it. But you are going to have to be sure that your users have support for it, because it's not a feature that you can polyfill the way that it works. So it is going to be a quality of life upgrade, and I hope it won't be long until you can start using this in your projects. Nesting. This is something that if you've used tools like SAS or LESS, CSS modules, etc., you have likely come across nesting before. It's so prevalent and in our tooling that it is becoming part of the language itself. So browser support is mixed, right? Chrome 112 and Safari 16.5 is in like the very latest version, have it. But I think because so much history exists, it's very likely that you can just keep what you have in your tooling now, or I guess add it with like post CSS. And once the browser support is there, you can just sort of remove that step from your build process, as long as you're sticking to this style. So again, we're going to look at our donut card, and with CSS nesting added. The syntax will look familiar if you've used some sort of nesting before. And it was actually voted on by the community, so that's why it's quite similar to those libraries that I was talking about. There's the main selector with any styling information that's needed for that component. And then we nest within that. So only the H2s within card are going to be styled here. And it saves us repeating that card selector, or if we want to refactor this to another name later, it's quite easy. And I guess just as an aside, if we have card and padding and border there, if we were to put more styles, say, below special there, they do get hoisted up. So keep that in mind if you do use these. And some of the other rules, this is again important to avoid the engine crashing or performance problems. It can't start with an alphanumeric character. So if we look at a selector here like image, the browser doesn't know, am I looking at a style definition or a nested selector here? So when you nest something like an image selector, you would start with the ampersand symbol, and then the parser knows, oh, okay, you're nesting here, right? Where you don't need to do that is for any that doesn't start with that. So classes, IDs, pseudo selectors like that. But if you want to be sure, like avoid the problem, you can just add the ampersand, right? And you'll be safe then. It's possible that requirement's going to be relaxed. There was a post from someone from the Chrome dev team on the spec that essentially said as much, but in a longer way. But of this talk, you still need it. And like those pre and post processes before, we aren't limited to nesting being in the front. So if we want to co-locate some of our styles, we can say the dark theme and the ampersand is referring to card. So it doesn't have to be just nesting in that way. And continuing that idea of co-locating, we can put our media queries and container queries into the nested area. So another good practice is to not go too far with the nesting, right? Generally speaking, they say no more than 5. You'll know what works for you and your team. But when you get beyond that, it starts to get a little bit confusing and like convoluted. So when this might not really change how you're working now, but it's interesting to see some of these nice to have features making their way into CSS natively. All right, into the future. Media query range syntax. Now I say future, this one is actually supported in most browsers, but it's like the newer one, so that's why I've kind of put it there. There is a post CSS plugin that will let you use it now. In my mind, I think this makes media queries much easier to understand. We can use mathematical operators to define a media query rather than min width and max width, because I don't know if you've ever done this thing like I have, where I've done min width and it's actually the other one that I wanted, and then you flip them and you're like, I'll definitely remember next time, and then you just do the same dance again. I heard someone refer to it like when you put USB in and then you flip it, and then you do it again. It's kind of how it feels like. And then a little bit further again, so there is no browser support for this one, but it is a post-CSS plugin and a spec, right? Like it's not just a plugin. And we use this in our design system now, is the idea of custom media queries. So we can define them like custom properties and then use them when we have @media. And this just gets rid of that whole problem of like defining the entire media query every time you use it, and those possible mistakes from using an incorrect value or having collisions in there. Define them as custom props, and then you can use them later. So I've found that one really handy. All right, let's have a look at how we can make the web move a little bit. View transitions. Now, I said at the start we weren't going to go too deep into some of the ones that aren't quite ready, but I think this one is really interesting, so I'm breaking my own rule here. It is only in Chrome 111 at the moment, without too much word on other browsers and what they're doing. But I think when you see kind of what it's doing, you'll hope that it's soon. This sort of view transition API is going to enable native app-like transitions. So if we look at Todoist's mobile app, when we navigate through this, we can see, all right, I've got to call mum, but it went up and animated and it transitions. It makes for a nicer experience. But this is kind of tough to do on web. It's not impossible, but it takes a lot of work, right? With View Transitions API, this is going to be much easier. I'll put the caveat up front this time. The current implementation, so the released version in Chrome, is single page application only. There is sort of multi-page applications, or sorry, not multi-page application support, but that's behind a flag. So I'm sticking with it, single page application only for the released version of it. But we'll head back again to our store. So this is an SPA that has a page with a list of donuts on it. If we want to transition, the sort of simplest thing we could do would be a crossfade. So as we come down and we click on Buy Now, we crossfade across to the next page, right? And that is sort of the default that happens with view transitions. Now this one does use JavaScript, so sorry. But document.start view transition is how we do that, and that has a callback. Inside that callback is where you update the DOM. So if it's React or Vue or something, there'll be some way that you can trigger that when you do that before the page sort of updates. What that does is sort of take a snapshot of the page where you were and a snapshot of the page where you end up, and adds them all as pseudo elements onto the page. So we have the view transition, which has the group, which has the image pair, and there's the old and the new one to visually sort of represent that. The view transition old, that's where we were, and the view transition new, that's where we're going. And the browser's going to sort of look at the two and figure out what needs to change between them. And where the power of sort of CSS comes in is we can control that with just CSS animation. So the browser's going to take care of it. If you're familiar with like the flip technique with animation, where I think it's first, last, invert, play, something like that. If you're familiar with it, this is sort of what the browser is taking care of for us. But we're not limited to just a view, like a transitioning of the entire page. So naming our sort of things is becoming very common in CSS or modern CSS. So we can do on our breadcrumbs, we can say view transition name is breadcrumbs. And now we get all of those pseudo elements again, specifically for where the breadcrumb is. So now on our page, we can define a different animation with a different time easing and a slide from right animation. And so when we click on that, so where the home is, we'll see that the donut or product has sort of slid in, but we're only targeting new here. So we can have a new animation that slides in, and then we just leave the other one and that will crossfade out. So you can do different elements, you can do on the way in, you can do on the way out. It's very powerful. Another really great advantage is that because it's CSS animations, we can use the debugging tools, right? You don't just have to set the animation duration to like 20 seconds when you're trying to debug something. We can play the animation, record it with the debug tools, play it back and see if there's any problems where that is kind of happening. So what I've done here is taken this sort of donut shop example and added a bunch of those named transitions. So we'll see some blocks fade in, they'll animate out, and they'll go back. And this is sort of the power of adding that then to multiple things. So when we click it, we'll see that the image went in, the text come up, then when we go back, the image goes back to where it was, and those cards all slide up. So each one is just a named CSS animation that we've done. We call start view transition, and then the browser figures it out for us. It's pretty powerful. Because of the way this works, it also can't be polyfill, right? There's no way of doing those screenshots that we were talking about. So progressive enhancement is the way with this one. If the document.startViewTransitions transitions doesn't exist, then you update the DOM, which is essentially what happens now, right? React will just do, or whatever, will do the thing that it does. If it is there, then you can start adding some of these things onto it and get the view transitions. The spec could well change, so keep an eye on it. Tobias Allen has a really good talk from Nordic.js that goes into much more detail about this. And Jake Archibald, when he was at Google, was kind of pushing this talk through, so he has some really good demos as well. But I think with Safari adding better support for PWAs, push notifications, the badge APIs in 16.4, what this might mean for kind of native apps and PWAs like that, or if it's just in Chrome, maybe it's something that you can take to Electron sort of apps and just start to use it now, and it'll be fine like that, and really add to the experience for users. Now, into the future, scroll-driven animation. So you'll likely have seen this pattern in designs where a user scrolls and an animation's happening, and it can be really subtle. So if we're scrolling the page, we can have a progress bar happening across. Or if you've been to Apple's website, it can be an entire experience for their product pages. But all of these have needed a ton of JavaScript, and there's scroll jacking problems and things like that. So both Chrome and Firefox are working on this idea of being able to link the animation timeline to the scroll, and then as you scroll, it will happen. Both are behind flags, something to keep an eye on. All right, let's see what's making the web more colorful. There's a lot of specs with color, 4, 5, and 6. And I think that just highlights the complexity of color in general. Last NDC, there was a talk on color, and that was like the whole talk. So if you really want some more detail, I'd suggest going and having a look at them. But we'll quickly touch on what's sort of happening now. CSS is going to increase the number of color spaces it supports by 10, this sort of list. For decades, web color has all been sRGB, so that means hex colors, HSL, and RGB. The problem is that it doesn't have enough colors for the devices that we have now. So modern phones and monitors are able to display way more colors than what we can actually sort of tell it to do. This is kind of thanks to those different displays. So the web kind of risks falling behind by not being able to show dynamic photos and gradients. They all have their advantages and disadvantages, and I think if you really want to dive into that, have a look at Adam Argyle's article on web.dev about that. But from my point of view, I think these will be the ones that in most cases we're going to start using, and I think LCH will be one of the ones that kind of starts to replace our use of sRGB. To use them is similar to how we use RGB now. We have, say, LCH, and then each of those color channels is a value, but some of them, like display P3, are still RGB or sRGB. So you'll say color, the color range that you want, and then the values for the channels. Now, apart from having much more colors, it'll also handle gradients quite differently. Here we can see a gradient defined in the sRGB color space first, and then the equivalent in the LCH. And we can see in sRGB there's sort of this grey part in the middle. It's a little bit dull, but in LCH it's quite vibrant. Now the way the colors move is different, and it can end up being that more dynamic color that we saw. So this is exaggerated, but it will typically use as straight a path as possible to sort of interpolate between the colors. And that's where you'll end up with that grey area in the middle, that dead zone. So this is our gradient again, and the very exaggerated path that it's taking. But we can add the following to our CSS. So we're saying the linear gradient to right in HSL, and we've added longer to it. So it's going to take the long way around. And we get a very sort of colourful gradient with those two colours that we picked. Or we can take the shorter way around, still longer, but shorter, longer. So to right in HSL, shorter on the hue channel. Not sure why that artifacts are happening, but I think it gives you the gist. That that bit in the middle wouldn't be there. There's an interesting gradient generator from Adam Argyle again, gradient.style, if you want to sort of look at these a little bit more. But with each of these things, you're going to, again, have to check the browser support. So if you want to be sure, you can do something like have the old color, right, progressive enhancement, and have the new color there. If it doesn't understand it, it drops back to the other one. Or with immediate queries and support queries, we can check if there's support for lab, and if it does, then we'll use that. If you have a lot of sort of high definition photos or like rich gradients on your site, then these are something that you might want to start looking at, particularly when designers start to use all of these different colors that we haven't had access to. Now, as I mentioned, color spaces, color theory, huge area. So this really just scratched the surface of what's going to be possible. Have a look at some of those other articles and people who have done really in-depth looks at these things. Accent color, though, is an interesting one. If you're supporting the main browsers, then you should be okay to use this one. One of those harder things to do in the web has been to style form elements, right? It was a bit of a mess. There weren't many options, and this meant that we ended up having custom components that try and hack around this problem, but then that just creates other problems. We might miss natively supported features like the indeterminate state of a checkbox. Or we could miss important accessibility features that we would otherwise just be getting for free if we use the standard elements. And a lot of users are used to what their operating system has given them for checkboxes and fields. And so if we completely change that, that can be quite jarring for them also. So in the ideal world, we can use the default elements, getting all that good usability and accessibility features for free, while having the forms match our design and UI. And this is what accent color is going to give us. And again, it's like one line of CSS that just gets rid of entire custom libraries for a checkbox, right? You say accent color and then give it the color for that, and it will change the colors of the components. There's 4 elements that this works on: checkbox, radio, range, and progress, as seen here. You'll notice and probably be sad that select isn't in there. That's one of those tricky ones. That's going to it's getting its own version of being able to be styled, but that's definitely in the future. And button, we've kind of been able to do that pretty well by ourselves for now. Now, this could expand over time, like I was saying, with select, but this is sort of what we have to start with. And the browser is doing like extra work for us when I talk about accessibility and usability. So here we've given it a pink color or a yellow color, and the browser's gone, okay, pink with the white check mark, that's accessible enough. But white on the yellow, well, that's not going to be visible enough. So it's flipped it to the black or the darker color so that it will see it. Now, each of the browsers is going to have a slightly different way of doing that logic. They all have their own methods and ways of doing things. So you're going to be putting a little bit of trust into the browser, and so you might see some slight differences. But that means that it might not exactly match the design as you wanted, but I think this is a pretty good spot for most sites to be in, that we get everything for free and we can use the platform while doing it, while having them styled. Okay, into the future. So mixing colors. So we've been able to do this with Sass and things like that, but it's coming to CSS. So we can do color mix in sRGB and have the 2 colors. So we have color A and color B. And as I'm moving the progress slider here, we can decide how much of the color that we want to mix into it. And it supports alpha, transparency, and different things like that. Relative color syntax is another really interesting one. So we have our background color. We're in, oops, the daisy. We're in HSL, so we're saying from a hex color. And then we get the H, the S, and the L channels. What we can do is then start to modify those channels if we wanted to. So we're saying calc on the hue, and we're timesing it by 10. So we're just sort of moving the color. The S and the L, we're leaving them alone. So you can just pass them through. But what we can also do is now add opacity to it. So with slash 0.5, this is actually like the only way we've been able to change the opacity of hex colors without changing the opacity of the entire element. So this will be a really powerful one. Color contrast, what we were just sort of seeing with those checkboxes, we're going to have the ability to do that ourselves. So the three of these combined, if you have custom theming or more to the point, users able to set colors on there, you're going to be able to make entire themes and accessible themes almost from one color. So we can say color contrast, we have our base color, and then we have color A, color B, and you can add more as well. And as we change this, it decides, okay, white wasn't going to work, I'll change it to the black color. White works on this one, that has the best contrast, and we can change the colors themselves. So, okay, yellow's the best option here. As we change, okay, now blue is the best option. Again, all just being worked out with CSS in the browser. Well, entire libraries just gone. I couldn't think of a category for the last ones. And more. We're getting trigonometry in CSS. I don't know if that's something you were wishing for, but here we are. You can do math. Sorry, yes, you can do math. It's in the three main engines, so you'd be pretty good. But we've had stuff like calc for a long time, and more recently we've had max, min, and clamp functions. But that is getting a real boost with trig, essentially. Specifically, sin, cos, tan, the arc versions or the inverse versions of them, and number 2. It had been a while, I'll be honest, since I'd used any trig in anything. Not quite high school, but it had been a while. So I kind of had to brush up a bit. Sin, cos, and tan is going to return the sine, cosine, or tangent of the angle. That's going to be between -1 and 1, or negative infinity, infinity in tan's case. The A does the opposite. So you'll give it the value and you'll get the angle back. Having access to all that sort of mathematical powers is going to enable you to do things like this. You'll have a donut box, and then when you activate it, you can have the donuts appear in a circle and choose the ones that you want in your thing. There's a lot of other things you're going to be able to do with trigonometry, but that was one that I thought was kind of a fun example for it. I'll let you have a look at it and figure out some of the things you do. But, you know, dynamic animation speeds, placing objects like what we saw, people with better memory of trig will have some really cool little things that they'll do with this. We're going into experimental territory on this one. This is only Chrome Canary. And this one is anchoring. So there's not much in MDM or can I use for this one. But the idea behind CSS anchoring is to anchor an element to another element. So we've kind of been able to do this with absolute positioning. But if something changed, we were, again, going into JavaScript land to handle that. So we can give the anchor a name. Right? That naming theme is coming through. And we can give it a position of that. And so here we have our tooltip. When we hover over the button, we see it appear. But if we were to scroll until that button was no longer visible, okay, we'll want to actually underneath now. And you can see this try-catch style position fallback here. So it'll say position fallback to the tooltip position. That's the name up the top. And then we're saying try, if this bottom and left position works, great, use that one. If not, okay, we'll try this bottom and this right position, and we'll do that. And you can, you know, keep going. And I think automatic will eventually become a sort of possibility in that as well. So you can link to multiple anchors. You can do all sorts of powerful things with it. Okay, whew. There we have it. So many new and exciting CSS features that you can either use now or very hopefully into the future. When you're working with a lot of components and features like container queries, has selector and nestings are really going to make that much easier and much more accessible for us. Subgrid is going to make working with layout easier again. color is getting colorful with these new kind of dynamic ways that we can define these things. And we can make our app seem more like native and responsive with view transitions. And all these sort of nice developer experience improvements with Cascade layers and custom media queries and the new range syntax that end users aren't ever going to see, but like it makes my life easier, so that's exciting. It's an exciting time to be working with CSS. And these changes are going to sort of further remove that need for pre and post processes, reduce the need for large JavaScript libraries, most importantly. The browser is going to handle so many of these things for us, and it's going to keep it snappy. Now, I've created demos for all of the CSS features that I showed today, and even ones that like I basically just didn't have time for. So there's anchor multiple, the anchor size, so that's sort of like container queries with anchors, where it'll know the size of the thing that it's anchoring to and then can adjust. I just didn't have time to go through everything. So there's color contrast and lots of things in there. If you want to dive into them and see them a bit more, have a look at what I've put up there on GitHub, and you can have a play with it. I can see someone taking a photo, so I'm just going to casually pause. What? Or do you want me to put it back? Yeah, quick. Yeah. Cool. So if you have any questions, I'll be around the conference. I'm hard to miss in this shirt. Feel free to reach out to me on Twitter as well. Otherwise, I hope you have a great rest of the time here at NDC Oslo, and thanks very much.